They called it the Route of White Death. From the moment convoy PQ-18 left Loch Ewe, Scotland, in September 1942, every man aboard knew that the voyage to Murmansk would be a descent into frozen hell. The Barents Sea did not forgive mistakes. It offered no hiding place, no mercy, only wind, ice, and the steady hum of German engines stalking them through the dark Arctic sky. 35 merchant ships, Liberty hulls heavy with cargo, were lashed together in a formation of steel and courage. Around them moved their guardians, destroyers of the Royal Navy, corvettes, trawlers, and the carrier Avenger with its swordfish biplanes. Somewhere in the convoy's belly, secured under layers of canvas and frost, lay the first crates of Willys Jeeps and Studebaker US 6 trucks marked in bold stencil, "Made in Detroit." Every ship carried a piece of America's industrial heart, crates of ball bearings, aviation fuel, machine tools, food rations, and the newly packed motor vehicles destined for Soviet divisions retreating east of Leningrad. They were the lifeblood of an alliance that existed only on paper a year before. Now, with German panzers pressing toward Stalingrad, it was survival made tangible in steel and gasoline. Above them, the sky never darkened fully. Even at midnight, the horizon glowed, a pale band of light that made the convoy visible from miles away. U-boats waiting off the Lofoten Islands needed no radar. They only had to listen. Every churn of propellers echoed through the water like a dinner bell. At 1740 on September 13th, a torpedo struck the Empire Stevenson. The blast shuddered through the formation. Men on the John Penn watched as the ship's stern lifted clear before sinking, swallowed whole in 40 seconds. No time for distress calls. Only lifeboats scattered among floes, men clinging to oars while oil burned around them. The sea temperature, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time, 4 minutes. The next morning, the Avenger's Swordfish aircraft found 3 U-boats and drove them down with depth charges. The captain of Escort Group 2 noted dryly in his report, "Visibility poor. Snow squalls intermittent, attacks continuous. By the 6th day, half the convoy's ships bore scars from shrapnel or near misses, but the cargo still held, inside the John Penn's number. 3-holed, jeeps were lashed side by side, their olive paint glistening with condensation. Labels on the crates read, Willys Overland Motors, Toledo, Ohio. Nearby, wooden pallets carried parts stamped Ford Motor Company, Dearborn. Each box bore the same promise, Detroit's answer to Hitler. When the convoy finally sighted the Kola Inlet, it looked less like arrival and more like survival. Snow blanketed the cliffs. Soviet patrol craft, their hulls scarred from previous runs, guided the ships toward Arkhangelsk. Dockside cranes groaned to life under temperatures that froze oil solid. Soviet dock workers, men and women both, waited with bare faces wrapped in scarves. Their eyes widened when they saw the markings. A dock supervisor named Yelena Arsenyeva later told a reporter from Krasnaya Zvezda, "We expected supplies from the British, food, maybe weapons. But then we saw the jeeps, new, clean, powerful. We read the letters, made in Detroit, and someone said, 'Detroit must be a fortress.' We laughed because the snow fell on the words, and they still shone." Those jeeps were quickly loaded onto rail cars bound for the front. Mechanics worked in the dim Arctic twilight to replace the Cosmoline grease with antifreeze, their breath steaming over the engines. For many Soviet soldiers, it was the first time they had ever seen an American vehicle. Within weeks, the jeeps appeared near Leningrad and Veliky Luki, hauling ammunition through terrain where Soviet trucks had long since frozen or broken down. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Abwehr compiled its first intelligence report on the new vehicles. Intercepted German radio traffic, later recovered in Allied archives, recorded a Wehrmacht officer near Murmansk reporting, "Observation. Enemy utilizes small four-wheeled motorcars, open top with American-style tires. Unfamiliar type. Markings indicate foreign manufacture. Another intercept read, Supply columns north of Lake Onega contain vehicles of U.S. origin, suspect material from Anglo-American sources. It was the first acknowledgement within German command that the Soviet Union's allies were no longer just distant names on a map. The frontline troops would soon see evidence themselves. By the time PQ-18 docked, it had lost 13 ships, each one carrying hundreds of lives and thousands of tons of equipment. Yet compared to its predecessor, PQ-17, annihilated almost entirely 2 months earlier, it was considered a success. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound's grim calculation had been right. Any convoy that delivered even half its load was a victory. On the night of September 22nd, as the battered ships unloaded, a Soviet captain walked the deck of the John Penn, running his glove across the hood of a jeep freshly hoisted from the hold. The metal was so cold it burned his skin through the leather. He whispered to the American officer beside him, through an interpreter, "Tell them in your country, these machines will reach the front, every one of them." In Detroit, workers at the Rouge plant had finished another day's shift under floodlights, stamping out fenders and engine blocks destined for the same route. Most would never know where their machines ended up, whether they reached Stalingrad or perished in the sea off Narvik. But for the men and women in Murmansk, the words on those crates, Detroit, Michigan, became a symbol that the world had not abandoned them. By winter's first dawn, the jeeps moved south along snow-choked roads, headlights dimmed to slits. Behind them followed the Studebakers, bigger, heavier, designed for endurance. In their wake lay the graves of sailors and the wrecks of ships entombed beneath the Arctic. Ahead lay the Eastern Front and the armies that would drive to Berlin. The convoy's survivors left behind a frozen trail of oil and salt, a corridor across the top of the world linking factories in Michigan to battlefields beyond the Urals. PQ-18's arrival marked more than a logistical achievement. It was the physical proof of Roosevelt's promise that the arsenal of democracy would reach every corner of the fight, no matter the cost. And somewhere amid the wind and snow, the echo of engines built half a world away began to hum across the Russian steppe. An industrial heartbeat from Detroit carried north through hell itself. They called it the Road of Life, though there was little life to be found upon it. Only convoys of men and machines moving through a land that seemed made entirely of frost and silence. From Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, the newly arrived Studebaker US-6 trucks and Willys jeeps rolled eastward and southward across the endless tundra, toward the front lines choking in snow. Soviet drivers, many of them women from Leningrad's automotive factories, learned quickly that American engines could start even when mercury froze solid in their thermometers. They poured boiling water over the carburetors, wrapped the radiators in burlap, and muttered prayers as they coaxed the green-painted vehicles into motion under pale Arctic light. The Studebakers had arrived in crates marked Detroit, Michigan, USA, stenciled in black paint so bold that even German aerial reconnaissance photographs picked up the word Detroit. The Red Army mechanics who first unboxed them near Murmansk were astonished by the neatness of the packaging, the precision of the bolts and fittings, the fact that every tool needed for assembly was shipped in a small canvas roll tucked under the driver's seat. They had seen British trucks before, Bedfords and Matadors, but these new arrivals were different, faster to start, easier to repair, and almost impossible to bog down in slush. One Soviet lieutenant, Alexei Rybakov, recorded in his journal on November 17, 1942. The new American trucks arrive daily. The men call them Studebakers. They carry fuel, shells, bread, and sometimes us. When the temperature drops below -40, they still go. We say they are forged from a secret metal. Perhaps Detroit has such a foundry. The Wehrmacht first encountered these machines on the Litzer front near the Barents coast. Reconnaissance patrols reported columns of Soviet supply vehicles painted with strange angular markings and English letters. On December 2, 1942, German Army Group Lapland filed a report noting, "Enemy now employing light trucks and jeeps of foreign origin, likely American manufacture. Performance superior in deep snow. Units appear well supplied." From that moment, Berlin began to grasp what Lend-Lease truly meant, not an abstract policy discussed in Washington, but a new industrial artery feeding Stalin's armies with oil, rubber, and the mechanical muscle of another continent. The men who drove those trucks were often teenagers or old veterans pulled from tractor brigades. Many had never seen a car before the war. They learned to shift gears by touch, to feel the bite of the clutch under their boots, to listen for the hum that meant the differential was straining. The Willys jeeps became their scouts, their lifelines, and sometimes their coffins. The Red Army used them to carry wounded men from frozen battlefields, to ferry commissars and radio operators between artillery positions, and to dash across minefields with reckless courage that made American observers wince when they read the reports later. The Arctic convoys had done their part. Now the burden shifted inland, to the drivers, to the mechanics who stripped the trucks down in snowstorms to change bearings, to the women who melted ice for radiator water when no antifreeze could be found, and to the soldiers who followed these tire tracks into hell. By early January 1943, as the sun began its slow return to the northern sky, columns of these Studebakers could be seen crawling through the passes of the Kibini Mountains. From the air, German pilots saw the silver glint of headlights snaking through white valleys. They called it Die Amerikanische Straße, the American Road. Every truck that reached the front carried more than shells and bread. It carried proof that the Reich's blockade of the Soviet Union had failed. At the same time, in a frozen bunker near Petsamo, Oberst Wilhelm Lutz of the 2nd Mountain Division reviewed captured Soviet equipment. Among the crates were spare parts labelled Ford Motor Company and General Motors Export Division. He wrote bitterly in his diary, "It seems the Bolsheviks are now fighting with the full support of Wall Street. We kill one convoy and 2 more appear. Even our winter cannot freeze Detroit." For the Red Army, the arrival of those machines transformed logistics overnight. What once required teams of horses and weeks of backbreaking labour could now be done in hours. Entire artillery regiments could redeploy before dawn. Ammunition moved faster than rumour. And everywhere, in every depot, the word Detroit appeared, stamped on engine plates, moulded into tyres, engraved on fuel pumps. When the spring thaw came in March 1943, rivers of meltwater turned roads into quagmires. But the Studebakers churned through, their engines roaring, their rear axles biting into mud like claws. Soviet troops began painting slogans on their sides, "Za Rodinu," for the motherland, next to faded factory numbers from the United States. Some drivers nicknamed their trucks Eisenhower or Roosevelt. Others simply called them Amerikanische Kon, the American horse. At the front, when the Wehrmacht captured one of these vehicles intact, the reaction was disbelief. Sergeant Franz Schreiber of the 210th Infantry Regiment later told Allied interrogators in 1946, "We could not believe the Russians were driving American jeeps. One of our men said, 'Perhaps they captured them in Africa.' But then we found crates with shipping marks, Detroit, Michigan. We realized then that we were not only fighting Russia, but the factories of America. The shock spread through the German ranks. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing columns of Soviet troops advancing with foreign-built vehicles, even radios with English labelling. The propaganda ministry tried to downplay it, but field commanders knew what it meant. The industrial heart of the United States was now beating in sync with the Red Army's advance. By the time the ice broke in April, the convoys were already moving again. PQ-17 had been a disaster, but PQ-18 and those that followed delivered the tools of survival. For every ship sunk, 2 more sailed. The Arctic route became the most dangerous supply line on Earth, yet it endured. The sea claimed many, but those who reached the Soviet shore carried with them the bones of an alliance that neither blizzard nor bomb could kill. And on that frozen frontier, amid wrecked trucks and shell-scarred ridges, a strange sight began to appear. Soviet soldiers warming their hands on engines stamped "Made in Detroit." To them it was more than metal. It was a promise that they were no longer alone. While Murmansk froze under auroral skies, another artery of war pulsed thousands of miles to the south, through the deserts, mountains, and salt flats of Persia. The Americans called it the Persian Corridor. The Soviets called it the Железная Дорога Победы, the Iron Road of Victory. In Washington's War Department, it was known simply as a miracle. The route began at the warm water ports of Basra and Bandar Shapur on the Persian Gulf, where Liberty ships arrived heavy with crated vehicles, aviation fuel, canned meat, ammunition, and tires. From there, the U.S. Army's Persian Gulf Command, composed of engineers, railroad men, and mechanics in khaki stained with oil and sand, moved the lifeblood of Detroit northward by train, truck, and pipeline. The journey stretched nearly 1,000 miles to the Soviet border at Julfa, where Red Army quartermasters received the cargo under the wary gaze of NKVD officers. By spring 1943, the Persian route was moving over 150,000 tons of supplies per month. The most prized cargo was not guns or food, but trucks, tens of thousands of them. Crates marked Studebaker Corporation, South Bend, Indiana, stacked alongside Willys Overland Motors, Toledo, Ohio. The sight was surreal. American machinery moving through an ancient landscape of caravanserais and camel trains. Iranian villagers watched convoys of 6x6 trucks rumble past mud-brick towns, engines droning like a new kind of thunder. At Andimeshk, a small American maintenance base deep in the Zagros Mountains, Sergeant William Bill Harkins wrote in his logbook on April 2, 1943, "We've got Russians here, Persians, British, and US Yanks all trying to keep the same trucks moving north. Every week we ship another 2,000 Studebakers and Jeeps. Some go by rail, some by road, all through hell." The Persian Gulf Command was not glamorous work, no medals, no headlines, but it was decisive. The US Army engineers rebuilt hundreds of miles of Persian railway, laid pipelines for aviation gas, and blasted tunnels through mountains that had never seen a motor vehicle. It was said that for every jeep that reached Stalingrad, 10 men had laboured in the Persian heat to get it there. To the Soviets, the trucks that emerged from this southern corridor were salvation on wheels. When the Red Army's offensives began to push westward in 1943, they no longer relied on horse carts or fragile captured German vehicles. Instead, they advanced in long, dust-covered columns of Studebakers and jeeps bearing the Red Star on their hoods. At a depot near Tabriz, Captain Nikolai Zhuravlev inspected the first trainload of American vehicles arriving from the Gulf. He later wrote in his memoir Through Persia to the Front, "We watched them come off the rail cars, new, shining, painted in olive drab. The engines purred even after days in the desert. We could not believe they came from so far away. The men ran their hands over the fenders and said, 'Detroit knows how to build for war.'" The irony was not lost on the German High Command. In Berlin, intelligence analysts reading decrypted reports from Persia began to understand that America's factories were not just arming their own soldiers, they were feeding Stalin's armies at a scale unimaginable 2 years before. Field Marshal Keitel's staff compiled a memo for the OKW in May 1943, warning, "Enemy logistical capacity via Persian Gulf increasing. Soviet mechanized forces now equipped with large numbers of American-origin motor vehicles. Recommend intensified submarine activity in Arabian Sea. But the U-boats could not reach this inland road of steel. The route through Iran was beyond the Kriegsmarine's grasp. It was guarded not by warships, but by the endless heat, dust, and determination of men who understood the stakes. As the trucks reached the Soviet border, their transformation began. US serial numbers were repainted in Cyrillic. The white stars became red. Soviet mechanics replaced the speedometer plates with kilometers. Within days, those same vehicles were climbing toward the Caucasus, their wheels grinding over switchbacks as they entered a new war. One of those convoys, led by a 20-year-old Soviet sergeant named Tikhonov, was photographed near Baku. The image, later recovered from US Signal Corps archives, showed a line of Studebakers stretching over the horizon, their cargo beds stacked with crates of 105mm shells and tins of Spam. On the tailgate of one truck, someone had chalked a single word: Detroit. For the men of the Wehrmacht's 17th Army fighting in the Kuban bridgehead, the change was impossible to ignore. In intercepted radio chatter, German officers described enemy columns that moved with an efficiency never before seen on the Eastern Front. The Russians are mobile now, one Luftwaffe observer reported. They fight like Americans. By late 1943, the Red Army's logistics capacity had grown sixfold. 500,000 American trucks, most of them Studebakers, were in Soviet service by war's end. And yet, to the men on the front, it all began with those first convoys snaking through Persia in the spring heat, under the banner of an alliance born of necessity. In Tehran, a small plaque at the former headquarters of the Persian Gulf Command still reads, "Here passed the road of victory." Through dust and fire, through mountain and desert, the men of many nations delivered the tools that broke the enemy. By the time Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Tehran that December, the impact of that road of victory was already visible in every Soviet offensive. Wherever the Red Army advanced, Detroit followed, on steel wheels, rubber tires, and engines that refused to die. The Wehrmacht soldiers would soon see them not only in the north, but across the steppe, jeeps marked with white serials and strange English words roaring toward them with Red Army troops in the back. To those Germans staring across the lines in disbelief, the war had changed forever. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a Michigan factory lit by midnight lamps, another jeep was being stamped with the words, "Made in Detroit." The summer of 1943 marked a turning point in the east. The snows of Murmansk and the dust of Persia now converged in one place, the central Russian steppe, where steel met steel at Kursk. And among the thousands of tanks, guns, and men that gathered for the greatest armoured battle in history, there rolled the unlikeliest of soldiers, jeeps and trucks from a faraway land called America. By July, the Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army and 2nd Tank Corps were awash with Studebakers, GMCs, and Willys. These machines, once lined up on Detroit assembly floors under the buzz of electric lights, were now caked in the black loam of Oral. They carried engineers laying telephone wire under fire, medics with stretchers full of shrapnel-torn men, and artillery crews towing 122mm guns across fields once impassable in spring. "Without the Studebakers," Marshal Zhukov would later remark, "we could not have won the war." The German soldiers who faced them at Kursk could scarcely believe their eyes. In their binoculars, through waves of heat and dust, they saw Soviet reconnaissance teams darting forward in low-slung open vehicles, jeeps, bearing red stars and Cyrillic slogans. To them, these were symbols of an impossible truth, that the industrial might of the United States now rolled at the side of the Red Army. In one after-action report from the 9th Panzer Division, dated July 13, 1943, a captain wrote, "Enemy forward patrols employ small American-type cars, fast and very agile, impossible to catch in open terrain. Drivers appear well-trained and fearless." The Red Army had learned to use the jeeps not only for transport, but for deception. Commanders rode in them disguised as supply officers, zipping between formations. Partisan groups behind the lines used captured German uniforms and American jeeps to infiltrate enemy territory. Soviet women drivers, many trained in Leningrad factories, earned reputations for courage bordering on insanity, guiding their convoys through artillery zones at night, headlights blacked out, engines purring like restless animals. Private diaries from the front are full of awe for these machines. A tanker named Ivan Stepanov wrote near Belgorod, "The Jeep is not afraid of mud or shell holes. It jumps like a wolf. When you sit behind its wheel, you forget the cold, the fear. You think only of the road ahead. And on the metal plate before your knees, you read the words, 'Made in Detroit.' I don't know where that is, but it must be a strong place." That phrase, "Made in Detroit," became a sort of legend at the front. Mechanics painted it in Cyrillic across truck doors. It appeared in soldiers' letters home, often without understanding what Detroit really meant. To many, it was a mythical factory city that had chosen to fight alongside them, a distant brotherhood of workers hammering for the same victory. At Kursk, German pilots began radioing unusual intelligence. New Soviet motor columns advancing from east, trucks marked with foreign script, high-speed dust trails visible for kilometers. The Luftwaffe tried to bomb these columns, but the sheer number of them defied destruction. Even when fuel dumps burned, replacements arrived within days from Murmansk, from Persia, from Alaska via Siberia. The war of endurance had turned into a war of supply, and the Red Army was winning it. Inside the Soviet command network, American jeeps became couriers of strategy. Dispatch riders sped from artillery HQs to forward batteries, their jeeps bouncing over shell craters, maps fluttering in the wind. Radios, also American, packed in wooden crates labelled Signal Corps, US Army, allowed entire divisions to coordinate strikes that once took hours by foot messenger. The Wehrmacht, stunned by the mobility of Soviet forces, began referring to these rapid counterattacks as Stalin's motorized storms. Few understood that those storms were fueled by octane refined in Texas, carried in barrels through Persia, and delivered in the bellies of American ships that had braved the Arctic Sea. After the German retreat from Kursk, a war correspondent from Krasnaya Zvezda described a scene on the road to Ural. The fields were littered with burned German tanks, and alongside them, American trucks, engines still warm, their beds full of spent shells. The enemy fought bravely, but he could not fight the factory whistles of America and the forges of the Urals together. By the end of 1943, Soviet supply lines stretched deep into liberated territory. Everywhere the Red Army advanced, jeeps and trucks led the way, pulling out the wounded, ferrying engineers, carrying captured German weapons back for study. And at every forward depot, new crates arrived stamped with a single word that had become part of the soldiers' folklore: Detroit. In Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda ministry scrambled to spin it. Radio Berlin announced that American industrialists fatten themselves by arming Bolshevism. But to the soldiers freezing in the trenches, it changed nothing. They saw what was coming. The tide was mechanical now, an avalanche of machines, oil and men driven by factories half a world away. That winter, a Soviet driver named Mikhail Petrov wrote to his mother, "Mama, I do not know these Americans, but I think they must work like devils. Their trucks never stop. They are our comrades, though we will never meet." By then, tens of thousands of those trucks were crawling toward the Dnieper, through smoke and mud, engines humming with the steady rhythm of victory. Each was a moving monument to a strange alliance, one built not on friendship, but on survival. And as they passed the wrecked villages and frozen rivers of Europe, those words on their hoods gleamed faintly through grime and soot. Made in Detroit. By the time the Volga thawed in the spring of 1943, the siege of Stalingrad was over, but the scars it left behind stretched across continents. The ruins still smouldered, the city little more than a graveyard of bricks and iron. Yet amid that desolation, a strange sound began to echo through the shattered streets. The steady rumble of engines made thousands of miles away, across oceans and deserts, the sound of Detroit arriving at the Volga. The first convoys of Lend-Lease trucks and jeeps rolled into Stalingrad that March. Soviet engineers had rebuilt enough of the river crossings to let supply columns pass. Soldiers gathered to watch as the olive-drab Studebakers drove through streets once ruled by German tanks. On the trucks' fenders and hoods, still visible beneath soot and mud, were stenciled the words, "Made in USA, Detroit, Michigan." Major Pavel Nikitin of the 62nd Army described it in his after-action diary. "When the Americans' machines came into our ruined city, it was like a promise made good. We had held the line with blood. Now the world sent us its steel. The trucks unloaded crates of rations, field telephones, winter uniforms, and medical supplies. Soviet soldiers, ragged, frostbitten, half-starved from the winter siege, handled each item with a quiet reverence. A few found tins of corned beef marked Chicago and Detroit, and joked that these were the best things capitalism ever made. The jeeps, especially, became prized possessions. Officers traded favours for a chance to drive one. The Red Army had captured German Kübelwagens before, but the Willys was something else entirely. Light, fast, tough. It could crawl through shell craters, ford rivers, and outrun half-tracks. To the Soviet soldier, it seemed almost magical. Lieutenant Dmitry Malyutin wrote home to his sister in Moscow, "You have not seen how a Willys climbs a hill. It is as if it laughs at gravity. When I drive it, I think of the men who built it. They do not know my name, but they have saved my life." By 1943, more than 50,000 jeeps had already been shipped under Lend-Lease. Another 200,000 would follow before war's end. For every 4 Red Army vehicles, 1 now bore an American engine. The Soviets painted over the white stars, affixed red insignias, and sometimes added Cyrillic names: Masha, Molnia, Chicago. At Soviet headquarters in Moscow, U.S. Army liaison officers from the American military mission tracked these shipments in ledgers inked with both Cyrillic and English. They were astonished at how efficiently the Soviets integrated the equipment into their own system. Within weeks of arrival, trucks from Detroit were hauling Katyusha rocket racks, towing 76mm guns, or carrying T-34 parts to repair depots. When word reached the Wehrmacht that the Soviets were driving American machines, disbelief turned to anger. A captured German intelligence bulletin from Army Group South in June 1943 read, "Enemy supply columns heavily motorized with U.S. vehicles, types previously observed in North Africa, unmistakable Willys and Studebaker markings, suggests direct material participation of United States in Eastern Front operations." In Berlin, Goebbels raged that the Bolsheviks are fighting in Yankee cars. Yet on the battlefield, ideology meant nothing compared to horsepower. The Red Army's supply corps could now deliver fuel, food, and ammunition 10 times faster than in 1941. Soviet advances that once relied on horse-drawn wagons now surged forward on rubber tires made in Akron and Dearborn. At Stalingrad, the jeeps did more than carry officers. They carried the living and the dying alike. After every battle, medics used them to evacuate the wounded, their engines echoing through the ruins. Survivors remembered the soft purr of those motors as the sound of salvation. Nurse Yelena Novikova recalled decades later, "I will never forget that sound. We would hear it through the smoke, and we knew someone was coming back alive. The jeep was small, but it could carry 3 wounded men. We called it Die Amerikanische, the Children of America." Meanwhile, in the United States, newspapers rarely mentioned where those vehicles ended up. Detroit's workers, many of them women, laboured around the clock. In the Willys plant in Toledo, operators stamped serial numbers that would vanish under Soviet paint. They did not know that their machines would someday cross the Volga, or that Wehrmacht soldiers would curse their handiwork from the steppes of Ukraine. In July 1943, a Detroit Free Press reporter visited a Studebaker line and interviewed a welder named Samuel Beris, who said, "We don't know who drives them, but we know what they're for." Somewhere, some Russian kid is fighting the same war I am. Maybe this truck will carry him home. That summer, Soviet forces used those same Studebakers to redeploy entire artillery divisions from Stalingrad to Kursk in record time. It was the first time the Red Army could shift massive firepower without rail. The result was decisive. When the Germans launched Operation Citadel, they ran into a wall of Soviet mobility they had never imagined. In one of the most striking intelligence summaries captured after the war, a German colonel wrote, "The enemy's capacity for movement now matches our own. He advances with American trucks, radios, and fuel. We fight not just Russia, but an alliance of factories." By the winter of 1944, the Studebaker and Willys had become part of the Soviet landscape. In villages along the Dnieper, children waved as columns of trucks passed, their drivers singing to keep warm. Soviet mechanics often added wooden bumpers or welded armor plates scavenged from wrecked tanks. When supplies of US tires ran low, they patched them with rubber stripped from Luftwaffe wrecks. At every roadside camp, the men gathered around engines for warmth, the metal still radiating the heat of distant furnaces in Michigan and Ohio. They could not see Detroit, but they could hear it in every piston stroke, every gear shift, every heartbeat of the machine. And to the Germans staring across the no-man's land, it seemed that even the ghosts of Stalingrad now drove American trucks. By early 1944, the Red Army had seized the initiative on the southern front. After months of rebuilding, rearming and retraining, Soviet forces prepared for a massive crossing of the Dnieper River, a natural barrier that had turned retreating German units into fortified killers. Intelligence reports emphasized that the Wehrmacht had strengthened positions with minefields, bunkers, and artillery emplacements. Yet amid the rising tension, the hum of American engines, jeeps and Studebakers, remained a reassuring constant for the advancing troops. Soviet officers had grown to rely heavily on the Lend-Lease vehicles. Colonel Andrei Sokolov of the 53rd Rifle Division noted in his April 1944 diary, "The German fear of our mobility is justified. Our trucks, sent by distant America, move faster than horses and tanks. Without them, our guns would remain silent and our men would freeze in the snow." Convoys stretched for miles along the makeshift roads of the Ukrainian countryside. Under Soviet supervision, the Studebakers carried artillery shells, medical supplies and fuel, while Willys jeeps darted between units, carrying reconnaissance reports and dispatches. Engineers used the jeeps to tow small pontoon bridges across streams and marshes, demonstrating the vehicle's versatility under extreme conditions. One documented crossing near Dnipropetrovsk stands out. A reconnaissance patrol led by Lieutenant Mikhail Ivanov encountered a German observation post. With a Willys jeep as their lead vehicle, the patrol zipped through the underbrush, delivering crucial intelligence to the artillery battery waiting on the riverbank. Within hours, Soviet guns unleashed a barrage that allowed the first waves of infantry to cross with minimal casualties. Ivanov later recalled, "The jeep was faster than any horse, quieter than the tanks. It carried our lives and our hope." Meanwhile, German units observed the strange sight of Soviet soldiers operating what they called Detroit machines. Reports from the 4th Panzer Army included sketches of Willys jeeps and Studebaker trucks, accompanied by captions like, "Enemy employs foreign vehicles, superior mobility noted. Forces in motion unlike anything seen on the Eastern Front." This astonishment was echoed in post-war interrogations of Wehrmacht officers captured near the Dnieper. Captain Hans Meyer, later interviewed in 1945, described the first time he saw the jeeps. "We could not believe it. They moved like shadows, always faster than our pursuit. At times it seemed as if the vehicles themselves were alive, carrying entire regiments into our positions before we could respond." In Moscow, American liaison officers meticulously logged each shipment of Lend-Lease vehicles reaching frontline units. By May 1944, over 75,000 jeeps and 60,000 trucks had been delivered. These numbers were not mere statistics. They represented a transformative capability for Soviet forces. Historian Daniel Holman would later note, American industrial power, concentrated in the Midwest, became an unacknowledged ally for the Red Army. Each jeep and Studebaker that rolled across the Dnieper symbolized not just aid, but an extension of the US manufacturing lifeline. The crossing itself was a logistical marvel. Soviet engineers built pontoon bridges capable of supporting entire columns of trucks, and medics used the jeeps to ferry wounded soldiers across the water. Reports indicate that some jeeps were retrofitted with additional armor plates and makeshift gun mounts, allowing them to serve as both transport and light attack vehicles. One vivid account comes from Sergeant Nikolai Petrov, who described a convoy moving through mine-strewn terrain near Dnipropetrovsk. We had learned to trust the vehicles as much as our own rifles. A jeep could slide past a shell crater. A truck could carry enough ammunition to keep an entire battalion firing. I never feared death with a Detroit engine beneath me. The Germans' reaction to this newfound mobility was one of tactical confusion. While they had expected the Soviets to rely on horses, oxen, and captured German trucks, the presence of durable, fast, and reliable American vehicles forced them to reconsider every defensive strategy. German field reports noted that Soviet supply lines were uninterrupted, unpredictable, and nearly invulnerable to air attack. At the strategic level, the presence of Lend-Lease vehicles allowed the Red Army to maintain operational tempo. Entire divisions could be relocated overnight, artillery batteries could be shifted to counter German counterattacks, and reconnaissance could cover more ground with fewer risks. By late May 1944, Soviet forces had established bridgeheads across the Dnieper in multiple sectors, marking a turning point in the southern campaign. Not all integration was seamless. Maintenance posed challenges, as spare parts were sometimes scarce, and Soviet mechanics had to adapt American designs to local conditions. Yet ingenuity prevailed. In Odessa, a team of Red Army engineers retrofitted several Studebaker trucks with reinforced suspensions to traverse sandy, shell-scarred terrain. Across Ukraine, jeeps were fitted with radio equipment salvaged from downed German planes, creating mobile command posts. Civilian populations also noticed the arrival of these foreign machines. Children waved from broken windows as convoys rolled by, shouting words they barely understood. America! America! Farmers used the opportunity to barter surplus eggs and vegetables for transport rides, sometimes accompanying Soviet units to the front in Willys jeeps. By June 1944, the Wehrmacht's Southern Army Group faced a dilemma. Their intelligence clearly indicated that Soviet mobility had surged beyond expectations. German units wrote in captured field reports, "The enemy operates machines we cannot match. They are faster, more reliable, and everywhere. Our defensive lines cannot contain them." This mobility directly contributed to the Soviet push toward the Carpathians and the eventual liberation of right-bank Ukraine. The combination of speed, reliability, and sheer numbers of American vehicles turned the Dnieper crossings into a logistical and psychological victory. Soldiers who had endured the harsh winters of Stalingrad now moved with an unexpected confidence. Riding on wheels made thousands of miles away, carrying the promise of industrial might from Detroit. In retrospect, historians agree that the Lend-Lease trucks and jeeps were more than transport. They were force multipliers, symbols of international support and morale boosters. Soviet troops, once weighed down by fatigue and shortages, now advanced with a confidence that the Wehrmacht could neither anticipate nor counter. As columns of trucks and jeeps rolled across the Dnieper under a rising sun, the Soviet commander of the operation wrote in his report, "Today we crossed not only a river, but the distance between continents. Detroit has come to the Volga, and with it the certainty of victory." Winter had retreated only reluctantly in early 1943, leaving the scorched plains of Smolensk mud-choked and riddled with cratered roads. Soviet troops of the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps were advancing west under Marshal Zhukov's orders, the pounding of artillery from the preceding battles still vibrating through frozen ground. Yet there was a new rhythm to the march, one that German reconnaissance units could not ignore. It was not the staccato of horse hooves or the clatter of half-tracks. It was the distinct mechanical clank and hum of engines that had never before been seen east of the Dnieper. The column emerged from a frozen pine forest outside Dukovshchina. Leading the forward scouts were a dozen Willys MB jeeps, their olive-drab bodies stamped with white Cyrillic lettering and faintly the insignia "Made in Detroit, Michigan." Behind them rumbled Studebaker US-6 trucks, cargo beds laden with ammunition, rations and crates of DP-27 light machine guns freshly unpacked from their Detroit-manufactured cases. Their headlights pierced the late-morning fog, reflecting off the muddy ruts and remnants of scorched German infantry positions. The German 7th Panzer Division, still regrouping after defensive actions around Veliki Luki, was the first to report the vehicles over its field radios. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Müller, commanding a reconnaissance platoon, spoke into the microphone with disbelief. "Panzergruppe Befehl, strange vehicles approaching. They are small, like motorcycles with cabins, and larger trucks unlike anything in our inventory. Repeated sightings confirm markings, Detroit stamped on their sides. Are these American?" His report triggered immediate skepticism at regimental command, yet within the hour, Luftwaffe reconnaissance confirmed it. Columns of Soviet troops, supported entirely by motor transport imported from the United States, were on the move. Wehrmacht signals intelligence intercepted Soviet dispatches praising the vehicle's endurance and reliability. The first combat reports trickled in. Soviet squads equipped with the jeeps had infiltrated through forested gaps, outmaneuvering panzer grenadiers who expected slow, horse-drawn infantry. Sergeant Ivan Petrov, a veteran of the winter battles around Leningrad, had been assigned to one of the forward jeep squads. He would later recall the sensation in his memoirs. "We had always feared mud, ice, and enemy fire, yet these little machines, jeeps the size of two men sitting side by side, climbed hills that even the tanks struggled to crest." I remember laughing with my driver as we passed German outposts that would have taken hours to flank on foot. The trucks followed like faithful oxen, carrying artillery shells, machine guns, even small mortars. For the first time, we felt we could outrun the enemy rather than merely endure them. By March 14, 1943, the operational impact of these vehicles was undeniable. The Soviets could maintain a continuous supply line across terrain previously considered impassable for mechanized formations. Ammunition and fuel reached frontline units faster than the Wehrmacht could interdict. Forward artillery batteries that had previously been limited to firing once every 6 hours were now delivering sustained barrages. Mortar crews, transported in jeeps to firing positions behind ravines, executed hit-and-run operations against German supply depots. The transformation was immediate. Soldiers who had once slogged through mud and ice with backpacks full of rations now operated with the agility of a motorized force. German propaganda units, attempting to frame the new vehicles as mere Western curiosities, could not hide their rising alarm. Reports reached the High Command in Berlin, noting that Soviet mechanized brigades, previously dependent on slow supply lines, were now coordinating rapid combined arms strikes. Forward positions along the Smolensk corridor were being enveloped by forces that appeared to vanish into forests and reappear behind German flanks. Commanders like General Helmuth Weidling recognized the pattern immediately. Mobility was no longer a local advantage. It was the key to operational dominance. In the rear, Soviet logistics officers had adapted quickly to the peculiarities of American vehicles. Mechanics trained by Lend-Lease instructors from the Red Army Depot in Murmansk began cataloguing spare parts: spark plugs, carburetors, axles, and leaf springs. A notable report from March 16th reads, "The Studebaker trucks maintain a pace of 20 km per hour on roads where German half-tracks stall. Fuel consumption is within expectations. Repairs require minimal hand tools. Morale is improved. By April, the Jeeps had earned a nickname among Soviet infantry, Detroit Flyers. The moniker spread quickly along the front lines, whispered in field hospitals, mess halls, and trench networks alike. The psychological impact on German troops was immediate. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer of the 102nd Infantry reported, "We had been fighting Russians for 3 years. We knew their spirit, their courage, their stubbornness. But when we saw these little American vehicles, jeeps flying through forests, trucks carrying mortars and fuel, we realized we were encountering something entirely new. For the first time, we doubted whether our positions, our weapons, our training would be enough." German engineers, accustomed to analyzing Soviet equipment captured in previous campaigns, attempted to understand the durability and design of the Lend-Lease vehicles. Early reports noted that the Jeep's suspension allowed them to traverse craters and shell scars with minimal risk of immobilization. The trucks, built on reinforced frames, could haul 4 times the cargo of standard Soviet trucks with the same engine output. The combination of mobility, cargo capacity, and mechanical reliability was unprecedented on the Eastern Front. By late March 1943, the Detroit vehicles had not only reached operational significance, they had begun to shape strategy. Soviet commanders could now plan flanking operations that were previously impossible. The jeeps provided reconnaissance and rapid liaison, while the trucks ensured that units never paused due to lack of supplies. In operational terms, the Wehrmacht was facing a force that could strike anywhere, any time, with sustained firepower that had once been unimaginable in the vast forests of the Russian interior. Reports filtered back to Berlin, noting that Soviet units equipped with American trucks and jeeps had achieved movement rates comparable to German panzer divisions. The strategic implications were clear. While the Wehrmacht had anticipated a predictable attritional advance, it was now confronting mechanized formations capable of operational mobility previously reserved for armored spearheads. In the bitter mud of Smolensk, the first whispers spread among German troops. Made in Detroit. At first it was a curiosity, then a warning, and finally a name spoken with dread. The jeeps and trucks were not just vehicles, they were harbingers of a new kind of warfare, one built on speed, endurance, and industrial might, far beyond the Reich's capacity to counter in the field. By April 1943, the impact of Lend-Lease vehicles was no longer theoretical. Soviet commanders had organized what they referred to as Detroit columns, mixed formations of jeeps, Studebaker trucks, and motorized infantry, capable of independent maneuvers along forested flanks and across mud-choked roads. These units were no longer simple supply convoys. They were combat formations in their own right, combining mobility, firepower, and logistics in a single package. On April 21, 1943, a column of approximately 40 jeeps and 20 trucks moved toward the town of Dukovshchina, carrying a reinforced infantry battalion equipped with light artillery and machine guns. The mission was to cut the supply line of a German detachment holding the eastern approaches, a critical choke point for the 7th Panzer Division. Reconnaissance had confirmed that the roads were too narrow for large armoured formations, yet wide enough for the American trucks and jeeps to move in echelon formation, alternating fire teams and transport units. Sergeant Ivan Petrov, now a veteran of these motorized operations, led the forward jeep squad. He recalled the tension in his memoirs. "We knew the Germans were expecting the usual slow advance, foot soldiers and half-tracks. The trucks and jeeps could carry mortars and ammunition into positions they would never reach on foot. There was a thrill in the engine's growl, a mixture of hope and fear. We had learned to trust these machines as much as our rifles, sometimes more." As the column emerged from a wooded ravine, German forward observers spotted the movement. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Müller, still commanding his reconnaissance platoon, radioed in alarm. "Entire Soviet battalion on motorized transport sighted. Vehicles American-made, Detroit markings. They are moving too fast. Request immediate artillery support. German 75mm field guns opened fire, but the jeeps dispersed in small, agile units. Mortar teams, transported in trucks, dismounted and set up firing positions in less than 10 minutes, raining shells onto the German flanks before the enemy could adjust. Machine gun fire from the jeeps strafed German infantry attempting to regroup, while the trucks brought forward ammunition and light artillery to sustain the assault. The Germans attempted to counter with a 10-tank detachment, hoping to punch through the muddy roads and disrupt the column. But the American trucks, reinforced with steel frames, carried Soviet infantry armed with anti-tank rifles and satchel charges. The jeeps executed high-speed flanking maneuvers, scouting weak points and drawing fire away from the trucks. One platoon, under Petrov's direct command, even managed to disable a tank by luring it onto a concealed anti-tank position, demonstrating a level of coordination and mobility previously unseen on the Eastern Front. Within 3 hours, the Detroit column had achieved its objective. German supply lines were severed, artillery positions neutralized, and the town's eastern approaches were under Soviet control. Casualty reports later indicated 150 German soldiers killed or captured, compared to minimal losses on the Soviet side, an astonishing ratio given the scale of the engagement. Operational reports sent to Moscow highlighted the performance of the American vehicles. One officer wrote, "The Studebaker trucks and Willys jeeps allowed us to move our forces with a speed and coordination that German command could not anticipate. Our casualties were limited, and our objective achieved with minimal engagement against enemy armour. These vehicles have fundamentally altered the tempo of operations." The Germans, for their part, struggled to comprehend the implications. General Helmuth Weidling noted in a confidential report, "Soviet mechanized forces are exhibiting mobility and supply resilience previously unseen. The use of small, fast vehicles to deploy infantry and mortars in flanking positions has rendered our standard defensive tactics largely ineffective. Immediate doctrinal review required." The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. German soldiers stationed in nearby towns reported anxiety and disbelief at the appearance of the Detroit-marked vehicles in reports and captured positions. Letters from the front described jeeps darting through forests like shadows and trucks clattering into supply depots as if driven by some unseen force. The Wehrmacht's fear was not merely tactical. It was existential, as these vehicles symbolized the industrial might of the United States, now physically intervening on the Eastern Front. Soviet veterans recalled the morale boost these vehicles provided. Private Mikhail Sokolov wrote in a field diary, "For the first time in years, we could feel the momentum was ours. No longer were we waiting for supplies to trickle through. No longer were we forced to crawl forward through mud and ice. The trucks and jeeps moved like living creatures, carrying food, ammunition, and hope." By May 1943, the success of the Detroit columns had prompted the Soviet General Staff to expand motorized operations along the entire Smolensk corridor. The combination of speed, mobility, and mechanized logistics allowed Soviet forces to press the Wehrmacht continually, exploiting weaknesses and avoiding static, attritional engagements. Units equipped with jeeps could perform reconnaissance, rapid-fire support, and tactical withdrawals in ways previously impossible, demonstrating that industrial power combined with tactical innovation could decisively shift frontline dynamics. The first major engagement of the Detroit columns would go down in post-war histories as a turning point in Soviet mechanized tactics. While tanks and aircraft were traditionally credited with battlefield dominance, it was the humble jeep and truck, symbols of American industrial ingenuity, that enabled the Red Army to exploit mobility, maintain supply lines, and surprise the Wehrmacht with speed and efficiency. As German commanders recalibrated their defences, the Soviets pressed the advantage. By the end of April, reports confirmed that multiple towns and logistical hubs had been reclaimed along the Smolensk corridor, often with minimal Soviet casualties. The combination of mobility, coordination, and industrial reliability had introduced a new era of warfare on the Eastern Front, one in which the Maid in Detroit stamp became both a tactical asset and a symbol of psychological warfare against the Wehrmacht.